Hi, enjoy listening. Sky above the Bitterroot Mountains had turned a bruised shade of blue as twilight settled into the forest like a secret. The pines stood tall and silent, cloaked in thick snow, their branches drooping under the weight of the storm. Somewhere deep within the woods, a man trudged forward, his breath coming in ragged clouds that hung in the frozen air before vanishing into nothing. His name was Harvey Boone, though he hadn't heard it spoken in months. Most folks who used to know him thought he was either dead or hiding. Both were partially true. Harvey's beard was thick and frosted with ice, matching the fur lining of his tattered shearling coat. His hat was hand-knitted and barely covered his ears. Every step he took sent him sinking up to his thighs into the untouched snow. His feet, stuffed into a pair of army-issue boots lined with wool socks, were half frozen, and his fingers were stiff with cold, wrapped in leather gloves that had cracked long ago. This forest had been his refuge for the last 15 years, until now. He paused by a fallen tree to catch his breath, leaning heavily against its trunk, eyes darting toward the distant ridge where he doubled back through the powder. The blizzard had covered his tracks well. With any luck, the men who were after him had followed the decoy trail toward the train depot where he'd left an old duffel bag full of nothing but scrap clothes he'd bought himself a few hours. Maybe less. It had all started 3 days ago, when Harvey spotted a stranger while out checking his traps. The man had been muttering to himself and hiding a bundle inside a hollowed-out pine. Harvey hadn't meant to spy, but instincts sharpened by years alone in the wild told him to keep still and watch. 5 minutes later, 2 heavily armed men appeared from the trail and dragged the stranger away, screaming. By the next morning, those same men showed up at Harvey's cabin. They hadn't knocked. One of them had a crowbar. The other had a gun. Harvey didn't wait to find out what they wanted. He took what he could carry, slipped through the trapdoor in the root cellar, and crawled out through a tunnel he'd dug years ago, just in case. He'd always thought he was paranoid. Turns out, he'd been right. Now, as the cold gnawed at his bones and the light dimmed to nothing, Harvey questioned whether survival had even been worth it. He hadn't eaten since morning. His last match had snapped in half, trying to light a fire behind a ridge. His coat, rescued from the depths of his cellar, was stiff with age and smelled of mildew. His hands shook from the cold, but also from something deeper, something knotted inside his gut for years. Memories, faces, a child's laugh, sweet and high like wind chimes in summer. He stumbled forward again, driven not just by instinct, but by a dull ember of something he thought long extinguished, the desire to live. He couldn't go back, couldn't be caught, couldn't die in this frozen nowhere. Just when he felt his legs begin to tremble beneath him, Harvey caught something unusual in the wind. A smell, barely there, but unmistakable. Bread. No, cinnamon. He froze, lifting his head, like a hound catching a scent on the breeze. It was faint, dancing just at the edge of possibility, carried by a soft northwesterly wind. But it was there. Years alone in the forest had tuned Harvey's senses to unnatural sharpness. Where others would have smelled only pine or frost, he turned toward the scent without hesitation. The forest darkened around him, but the aroma grew stronger. It pulled him like a lifeline. Someone was out there. A house, a kitchen, a human. Warmth. 10 minutes later, Harvey saw it. A flickering orange light through the trees. A window. His knees buckled as he reached the edge of a clearing. A small wood frame house stood at its center, dark except for the kitchen window. The scent of cinnamon rolls hit him like a freight train. His mouth watered. His eyes welled. Then everything went black. The warm glow from the kitchen window spilled across the snow like a blanket, casting long amber shadows that danced gently with the wind. Inside, Delaney Rhodes pulled a tray of cinnamon rolls from the oven, setting it gently on the stovetop. The scent of brown sugar, spice, and vanilla filled the air, comforting as an old song. She leaned against the counter for a moment, brushing a loose strand of honey blonde hair from her face. Her cheeks were pink from the heat of the stove. Her blue flannel pajamas dusted with flour. The old house was quiet, except for the ticking clock and the crackle of the fire in the living room. It was nearly midnight. Delaney should have been asleep. But sleep had become something of a stranger lately. Too many worries keeping her up. Her job at the clinic had gotten heavier since winter began. The long commute, the endless patients, the bitter cold. But she didn't complain. She never did. She had baked these cinnamon rolls not for herself, but for the elderly patients she saw at the town's small rehab hospital. The kind of people who had no family visiting, no homemade meals waiting. Some of them hadn't tasted a fresh-baked roll in years. She knew how that felt. To be forgotten, to be passed over. Delaney had grown up in the foster system after her mother died of cancer when she was just 10. No one knew who her father was. At least, that's what she was told. Her mother had been a difficult woman, fiercely proud, fiercely cold. There were no family photos, no bedtime stories. Just a suitcase and a bus ride one morning, and then she was gone. For years, Delaney had clung to one blurry memory. Her father lifting her into the air, spinning her in circles, both of them laughing. She could never quite remember his face, only that his arms had felt safe, his voice warm. After he left, all was taken from her. That sense of safety vanished. The state had placed her in 6 different homes by the time she turned 18. She earned a medical assistance degree through a state program for foster youth, and eventually a small 1-bedroom house in a rural Montana town is deeded to her as transitional housing. She stayed because it was quiet, because here nobody expected too much, and because people here were kind, mostly. Still, it wasn't easy. A loud gust of wind rattled the shutters. Delaney blinked. She'd been staring into space, the warmth of the kitchen making her drowsy. She turned off the oven and began cleaning up, humming a quiet tune under her breath. And then, knock, knock. She froze. Not loud, not panicked, just deliberate. 2 slow knocks at the front door. Her breath caught in her throat. No one ever visited at this hour, not in this town, and certainly not at her house, which sat at the edge of the woods, a full 10-minute walk from the nearest neighbor. She wiped her hands on a dish towel and quietly stepped toward the window, gently parting the curtain. A man, tall, hunched, a wild beard covered half his face, his coat glistening with frost. He looked like he'd walked out of a mountain legend. His knees buckled, and he slumped forward, one arm catching the porch post. Delaney's heart thudded in her chest. Every instinct told her to lock the door, turn off the lights, call someone. But who? Then she looked again. He wasn't dangerous. He was dying. She grabbed a flashlight and pulled on her heavy wool cardigan, cracked the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold bit into her instantly. "Sir," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "Are you all right?" The man didn't speak. His lips were pale, his eyes dull with exhaustion. He tried to raise a hand, but failed. His body sagged, as if every bone had given up. "Oh God," Delaney whispered. She stepped forward and caught him beneath the arm. He was heavier than he looked, but she managed to help him across the threshold, dragging his half-conscious frame into the warmth. He collapsed onto the bench by the fireplace with a groan. She knelt beside him and reached for a wool blanket, wrapping it around his shoulders. "You're freezing," she said, already boiling water on the stove. "Don't fall asleep. You need to warm up slowly." The man's eyes fluttered open. He stared at her, really stared, as if he'd seen a ghost. His gaze drifted to her hands as she placed a mug of tea in front of him. Then his voice came, barely a whisper, cracking like dry wood. "Your name, it wouldn't be Delaney, would it?" She blinked. "Yes, how did you know that?" His lips trembled. He looked away, eyes glistening, and mumbled, "I'm sorry. You just remind me of someone I used to know." Delaney stared at him, unsure whether to feel comforted or unnerved. I hope you don't think I'm foolish for letting you in," she said, trying to make light of the moment. Most people don't open their doors to strange men wearing old coats in the middle of a blizzard. The man smiled faintly. No, most don't, but you did. She smiled back, and for the first time in a long while, the little cabin felt like it wasn't just hers anymore. Delaney sat across from the stranger as he sipped slowly from a chipped ceramic mug. The tea had started to bring a touch of colour back to his face, though he still looked pale and worn. His clothes were damp and stiff with cold, and the thick coat he wore gave off the faint musty smell of old cedar and forgotten years. She studied him in silence. He seemed older than he probably was, maybe mid-50s, though the weather and whatever life he'd led had carved deeper lines into his face. His eyes were a soft, stormy grey, intelligent, alert, but hollowed out by time. He didn't talk much, didn't explain who he was or where he came from. He just sat there, hunched forward, fingers clutched around the mug as if it were the last warm thing in the world. Delaney finally broke the quiet. You need to rest. I've got a spare blanket and a couch that doesn't sag too badly. You can sleep by the fire. He looked up, startled. I don't want to cause trouble. She gave a tired smile. You already collapsed on my porch. You've earned a night on the couch. The man nodded, slowly. Thank you. She stepped into the hallway to grab a blanket and pillow. When she came back, he was staring into the flames, lost in thought. She handed him the bedding, and he whispered a quiet thanks again. Do you have a name? She asked gently. He hesitated. Harvey, he said at last. Harvey Boone. Mr. Boone, she nodded. I'm Delaney Rhodes. He looked at her again, with that same searching intensity. That's a strong name, he murmured. She tilted her head, curious. My mum picked it. She always said it sounded elegant, but I never knew much about why, or about my dad, really. A flicker passed across Harvey's face, something like pain. Delaney sat down at the kitchen table again, fiddling with a spoon, her voice quiet. She raised me on her own. We moved around a lot. She passed when I was 10. I'm sorry, Harvey said. She never talked about him. My dad, I mean. But I remember him, just a little. He used to carry me on his shoulders, called me Button. He smelled like cedarwood and coffee. I think I was happy back then. Harvey's fingers tightened slightly on the mug, but then he was just gone. Mum never explained. And the next thing I knew, we were packing up and leaving town with a man I didn't know. She looked up at him. You ever lose someone like that? Someone who just disappeared one day? Harvey didn't answer right away. He just nodded, slowly. Yeah, he said hoarsely. I did. Delaney sighed and stood up. Well, the couch is all yours. I've got work in the morning, so I'll be out early. Stay as long as you need, okay? He gave her a grateful smile that barely reached his eyes. You're very kind. She turned off the kitchen light and headed toward her room, leaving Harvey alone with the fire. But he didn't lie down. He stared at the flames, at the ceiling, at her empty teacup, Then, as the last embers of the fire glowed low, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. An old photo. A girl, maybe 9 or 10, standing next to a man in a baseball cap, both of them smiling, like nothing bad had ever happened. The girl had long hair tied in a ribbon and a birthmark on her right hand shaped like a tiny heart. Harvey looked toward the hallway where Delaney had disappeared. It couldn't be, but the heart-shaped birthmark was there. He'd seen it on her hand when she handed him the mug. The exact same shape, the exact same spot. His daughter, the child he had lost 15 years ago. His voice broke as he whispered her name into the empty room. Button. Harvey didn't sleep that night. He lay on the couch, eyes wide open, watching the last of the fire dim to ash. The warmth in the room did little to calm the storm inside him. His thoughts churned with questions, regrets, and a strange, fragile hope. Could it really be her? The little girl with the heart-shaped birthmark, who used to fall asleep on his chest as he read her bedtime stories. The child who used to wait by the window when he came home from long trips with snow globes and postcards. The daughter ripped from his life with no warning, no goodbye. Now a grown woman offering tea and cinnamon rolls to a stranger freezing in the woods. His mind reeled with memories he'd tried to bury. After the divorce, her mother had promised he could still see Delaney. Every other weekend, she said. But then she stopped answering calls, moved without leaving a forwarding address, filed new paperwork in another state under a different last name. Harvey had spent every dime he had trying to track them down, hired a private investigator, posted letters. Nothing. Eventually, he lost everything. His job, his savings, his apartment. And then he lost hope. That's when he came out here, to the mountains, and built himself a new kind of life. Quiet, isolated, numb. But she was alive. His daughter was alive. He heard movement from down the hall and quickly tucked the photo back into his coat. Delaney emerged, already dressed in scrubs, her hair pulled into a ponytail. She carried a tote bag over her shoulder and moved quietly, trying not to wake him. "You're up early," she said with a sleepy smile. "Didn't sleep much." She nodded. "Well, there's coffee in the thermos if you want some. I made extra." "Thanks," he said, voice still raw. "You heading to work?" "Yeah. The clinic's 2 towns over. I catch the train at 6. Harvey furrowed his. "I don't know what your plans are, but you're welcome to stay here while you figure things out. Seriously. I've got food, heat, an extra pair of gloves if you need them." Harvey stared at her, overwhelmed by her kindness. I don't know what to say." She tilted her head. "You could say yes." He did. Delaney left shortly after, and the cabin fell into silence again. But it felt different now, less empty. Harvey walked slowly through the space, taking in the cozy, mismatched furniture. The photographs taped to the fridge, the old radio sitting on the counter. He picked up a framed picture of Delaney and an older woman. Her mother? No. The inscription on the back read, "With love from Miss Jody, my favourite case manager, 2011. He exhaled. So she'd been in the system. He'd known that was likely, but seeing it written down still hit him like a punch in the chest. She'd needed him, and he wasn't there. All day he stayed inside, warming up, resting, and thinking. By the time Delaney returned that night, arms full of groceries and cheeks red from the cold, Harvey had tidied the house, chopped some firewood, and shoveled the porch. It wasn't much, but it was something. "Wow," she said, stepping inside. "You didn't have to do all this." "I know," he replied softly, "but I wanted to." She smiled, and something in that expression pulled at the deepest corners of his soul. She looked so much like her mother, but her eyes were all his. That night, over soup and bread, they talked. About nothing at first. Her job, the weather, the rising price of gasoline. But slowly, the conversation deepened. She told him about her childhood, how she bounced from foster homes until one kind caseworker helped her get into a medical program, how she'd nearly lost hope of becoming anything at all. Harvey listened. Every word was a thread, stitching back the tapestry of a life he'd missed. He still hadn't told her who he was. Not yet. He didn't want her to see him as a ghost from a broken past. He wanted her to see the man in front of her, not just the one who'd vanished 15 years ago. He needed time. Maybe a day, maybe 2. But he would tell her. He had to. Because the longer he stayed in that little house at the edge of the woods, the more it felt like something he hadn't felt in years. Home. By the 3rd day, Harvey was no longer a guest. He was simply there. A quiet, steady presence. He chopped wood without being asked, fixed the drafty window in the back room, and repaired the broken leg on the coffee table. When Delaney came home from the clinic, exhausted and wind-chapped, she found dinner already simmering, or the kettle just starting to whistle. She never said it aloud, but her eyes told the story. She was grateful and tired of being alone. Harvey didn't push for conversation. He didn't ask questions about her past or probe into the gaps she left when she talked about her childhood. He waited, patient, gentle, but alert. It was Delaney who opened the door one night, after a silence stretched too long over dinner. "Do you believe some people are just born into the wrong story?" she asked, poking at her mashed potatoes. Harvey glanced up. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "I mean, when I was a kid, I used to dream about some other life. One where my mum didn't cry behind closed doors. One where we didn't move 3 times in a year. One where I didn't have to wake up wondering what stranger would be making my breakfast next." She paused, breathing carefully. "And always in that dream, there was a man. Harvey's fork froze mid-air. She looked down at her plate. Not a boyfriend. Not later. A dad. A good one. One who showed up to parent-teacher night and scared off the jerks in the neighborhood. One who told me I was brave. She gave a small, bitter laugh. I used to imagine he'd come knocking one day, out of nowhere, like he'd finally found me. But of course, no one came. Harvey swallowed hard. That doesn't mean he didn't look. Delaney raised her eyes. What makes you so sure? He looked at her, steady. Because a man who loved his kid would never stop looking. Not unless he was forced to. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly, but she didn't press. I used to be angry all the time, she admitted. At him, at her, at everyone. But anger, it eats you from the inside. So one day, I just stopped expecting anything. That was easier. Harvey nodded slowly. Easier, but colder. She studied him for a moment. You talk like someone who knows. I do. The silence that followed wasn't tense, but it was loaded. Like both of them were standing at the edge of something fragile. Later that night, while Delaney showered, Harvey stepped out onto the porch with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The stars above the pines blinked in perfect silence, their light icy and distant. He pulled the photo from his coat again and stared at it under the porch light. What would she say if he told her? If he confessed that the man in her dream, the one who never showed up, had been no further than a few counties away for most of her life? That he'd watched her grow up through dead ends and court records and search engine scraps until he gave up, broke down, and vanished into the woods. He was ashamed, more than ashamed, afraid of her anger, of her disappointment, of ruining the fragile warmth that had begun to grow between them, inside. The sound of the shower stopped. Harvey folded the photo back into the cloth and slipped it into the pocket closest to his heart. He wasn't ready, not tonight. But he had made her cinnamon rolls again that morning, the way she liked them, light, fluffy, with a touch of clove in the icing. She hadn't even noticed, but that was okay. Sometimes love was quiet. Sometimes it looked like firewood stacked just right, or boots dried near the hearth. Sometimes it looked like a stranger who didn't ask too many questions, but always had the kettle boiling. Harvey stepped back into the cabin and closed the door behind him. The warmth inside wasn't just from the fire anymore. It was from her. A week passed. Harvey stayed. Delaney didn't ask when he planned to leave, and he didn't offer. The quiet rhythm of their days settled into something almost domestic. They weren't quite roommates, not family either, not yet. But there was comfort in the routine. A pot of coffee always brewing, the shared silence of a snow-covered evening, the soft sound of the radio, humming old country songs in the background. And then, Without warning, the peace shattered. It was a Friday evening. Delaney had just returned from work, cheeks pink from the cold, hands raw from a long shift. She kicked off her boots, set down her tote, and walked into the kitchen, expecting to find Harvey at the stove or reading by the fire. Instead, she found him staring out the window, frozen still. "What is it?" she asked, stepping closer. Harvey didn't answer. His jaw was tight, fists clenched at his sides. Delaney followed his gaze. A woman stood at the edge of the property line, mid-40s, thin frame, wrapped in a too fancy coat for a place like this. Her dark hair was slicked back, her makeup deliberate. She was out of place here, like a crow in a field of snow. And she was staring directly at the house. Harvey muttered, "No, no, not now." Delaney turned sharply. "You know her?" He nodded, lips drawn into a grim line. "Her name's Celeste." "Friend?" He shook his head once. "Far from." The woman didn't approach the house. She just stood there, unmoving, watching. "Is she going to come up?" Delaney asked uneasily. Harvey's voice was low. "She will, once she's sure she can get what she wants." Delaney narrowed her eyes. "Which is?" He hesitated. "Not sure yet, but nothing good." As if summoned, a knock echoed at the door 5 minutes later. Delaney opened it slowly. The woman gave a tight, forced smile. "Hi there. Sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for a friend of mine." Tall man, grey hair, a little rough around the edges. Might go by the name Harvey. Harvey stepped into view behind Delaney. "I'm not your friend, Celeste. You made sure of that." Celeste's smile tightened. "Still full of dramatics, I see." Delaney glanced between them. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Celeste's eyes swept over Delaney's face like a scanner, calculating. "And you must be the caretaker." Cute place. Rustic. "She's not the caretaker," Harvey growled. Celeste raised an eyebrow. "Then what is she?" "That's none of your business." Celeste's gaze sharpened. "Actually, it is. Considering you're squatting on land that isn't yours. Again." Delaney blinked. "This is my house." The woman gave a dry laugh. "Sure, for now. Until the county remembers the back taxes and someone decides to press on that expired title. I'm guessing you didn't know the cabin technically sits on disputed land, did you?" Delaney stiffened. Harvey stepped forward, voice cold. "What do you want?" Celeste dropped the smile. "You, back. You think you can walk away from everything and disappear. You owe people, Harvey. People who don't forget. I don't owe you a thing." "Oh, but you do. And if you don't come back with me now, I might just take a good hard look at this cozy little setup. Because a man with your record really shouldn't be hanging around vulnerable young women, should he?" Delaney's eyes widened. "What are you talking about?" Celeste leaned against the porch rail, savouring the drama. "Oh, he didn't tell you? That's a shame. Harvey here spent 2 years behind bars. Assault. Some misunderstanding with a social worker. but I'm sure it was all a big mistake." Harvey looked at Delaney, jaw clenched. "She's twisting it," he said, voice thick. "I pushed a man who tried to shut down the shelter. He slipped, hit his head. I didn't run. I stood trial. Served my time." Celeste smirked. "That's one version." Delaney stared at him, the trust in her eyes trembling, but not gone. Finally, she turned back to the woman. "This isn't your home. You're not welcome here. Leave." Celeste's eyes flashed. "Think very carefully, sweetheart. You don't know who you've let in." Delaney didn't flinch. "I'll take my chances." Celeste gave Harvey one last long look, then turned, her heels crunching across the frozen path. She disappeared into the woods as quickly as she had come. Delaney closed the door. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows. Harvey stood near the fire, staring into the flames. Delaney watched him for a long time before she spoke. "Why didn't you tell me?" He turned slowly. "Because I didn't want you to look at me the way you are now." Her voice cracked. "How am I looking at you?" "Like I might break everything good in your life." Delaney stepped forward, breath unsteady. "You fixed my door. You fixed the leak. You leave coffee in the thermos every morning. You listen more than anyone ever has. You didn't break anything, Harvey." He met her eyes, stunned. "But," she added, quieter, "you still haven't told me the whole truth, and I need you to." He nodded, grief welling up in his throat. "Tomorrow, I promise." She didn't press, just stepped past him and added a log to the fire. The room warmed again, but something between them had shifted. The shadows had arrived, and they were here to stay. The next morning, Delaney woke early. She expected the fire to be crackling, the smell of coffee in the air, maybe even the quiet shuffle of Harvey stacking kindling. But the house was silent, cold, still. She pulled on her sweater and stepped into the living room. Harvey was gone. The front door was shut but unlatched. His boots were missing from the rug. The kettle was cold. On the table, folded with neat precision, was a single piece of paper. She unfolded it with shaking hands. "Delaney, I never meant to bring trouble here. Celeste will be back, and she won't stop stirring mud until it sticks. I figured it's safer if I go. You deserve peace. I'll explain everything someday. I just need time. Don't look for me, please." Delaney sat down slowly. The paper fluttered between her fingers like something fragile that had already been broken. For a long time, she didn't move. Then, with a resolve that rose like heat through her chest, she stood, tossed the note into the fire, and grabbed her coat. She found him 2 days later in the abandoned train station west of town. The place hadn't seen a schedule since 1998, but it was dry, quiet, and impossible to spot from the road. She only knew it because she'd volunteered there once, helping an outreach worker distribute blankets to the homeless. He was sitting on an old bench, arms crossed, eyes distant. I told you not to come, he said without looking at her. She didn't respond, just sat beside him and pulled a thermos from her bag. Chamomile, she said, unscrewing the lid. I figured you'd need something warm. He blinked. You brought me tea, she shrugged. You forgot to pack yours. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Then, Celeste said something I haven't stopped thinking about, Delaney murmured. About you having a record. About you being dangerous. I was, Harvey admitted. A long time ago. Not in the way she meant. But I've hurt people. I've made terrible mistakes. Delaney stared down at her hands. Tell me. He took a breath. I was 25 when I met your mother, Alicia. Beautiful, clever, reckless. We weren't good together. Too much heat, not enough balance. But we had you, and for a little while, that was enough. Delaney turned to him sharply. What do you mean we had me? He didn't answer right away. I'm your father, Delaney. The words struck like thunder, sudden, final, and heavy with silence. Delaney froze. No, that's not... No, my mother said he left, that he was dangerous, that... She ran, Harvey said quietly. Took you while I was at work. Disappeared into another state. I searched for years, hired people, spent every cent I had. Delaney's voice cracked. Why didn't you find me? I tried. His voice was hollow. But she changed your name, moved from shelter to shelter, lied to everyone. I didn't even know where to look anymore. Eventually, I lost everything. My job, my mind. I started drifting, ended up in places that swallowed me whole. And the arrest? She asked. I hit a man who was threatening a pregnant girl in a shelter. Pushed him too hard. He fell and hit his head. Delaney looked away. The wind howled through the cracks in the windows. I used to dream about you, she said softly. This man I couldn't remember. I thought I'd made him up. You didn't. Tears welled up in her eyes. You're really him? I am. She didn't speak for a long time. Then, finally, she held out the thermos. Drink your tea, she whispered. You look like hell. He let out a shaky laugh and took it from her hands. Delaney leaned back on the bench, eyes glassy but calm. I'm not ready to forgive you, she said. I don't expect you to, but I don't want to lose you again. Not now. He turned toward her, eyes wet. I'm not going anywhere. That night they returned home together. The fire was cold, but it didn't take long to warm. Delaney went to her bedroom and pulled something from a drawer. A necklace, small, silver, with a tiny locket. She'd worn it since she was 9. Said it came from a man in a memory too faint to trust. She opened it. Inside was a photo. Faded. A man and a baby girl in his arms. She handed it to Harvey. He stared down at it, his hands trembling. Then, for the first time since that cold night on her porch, Harvey Boone wept. Not for what was lost, but for what had finally been found. Celeste didn't return right away, but the threat of her hung in the air like smoke after a fire, clinging to the corners of the house, lingering in their conversations. And then the letter came. No return address. Just Delaney's name, typed on a white envelope. Inside, a legal notice. To whom it may concern, the property at 214 Morgan Creek Lane is subject to an unresolved deed dispute dating back to 1987. A formal challenge has been filed claiming rights to the land. Until the matter is resolved, occupants are advised to vacate. County Records Office. Appellate Division. Delaney dropped the paper on the table like it burned. Disputed? She said aloud. My aunt left me this place. I have the will, the keys, the title. Harvey picked up the paper and read it twice. This didn't come from the county, he said flatly. Look at the font. The seal's a scan. Delaney stared at him. You're saying she faked it? She's putting pressure on you, trying to spook us. Well, it's working, Delaney snapped, then instantly regretted it. Sorry, you're not going anywhere. He tapped the notice. And neither is she. But Celeste didn't come back alone. 4 days later, a shiny black SUV pulled up just before sunset. 2 men in crisp jackets stepped out and began walking the perimeter of the cabin, like they were measuring a coffin. One of them took photos. The other jotted notes on a clipboard. Delaney stood on the porch with her arms crossed. Can I help you? One man looked up. Property inspection. Legal review. By whose authority? He smirked. Miss Chandler, acting co-owner. Harvey appeared beside her, face stone hard. You tell Celeste if she wants to come for this place, she better do it herself. I'd love the chance to explain to a judge why she's forging county seals and sending fake eviction notices. The man just smiled and walked back to the SUV. Delaney watched them drive off. Do you think that'll scare her? No, Harvey said quietly, but maybe it'll make her reckless. That night, they didn't sleep. Harvey sat by the window, rifle across his lap, staring into the trees. Delaney stayed at the kitchen table. Old documents spread across the surface. Land surveys, letters from her aunt, faded photographs of the cabin in summer, when the garden had still bloomed. I found something, she said around 2 a.m. Harvey looked up. She held out a brittle envelope, addressed in shaky cursive to her aunt. In case of my passing, please file this with county land records. The East Acres belong solely to Delaney. Deeded and witnessed. Harvey Boone. Enclosed, signed property agreement. Harvey took the letter with trembling fingers. I forgot I did this, he murmured. Back before Alicia ran. I knew I couldn't keep her, but I thought maybe I could keep something for you. Delaney's eyes filled. You gave her this land? I had no money, no job, just the deed, and a baby I loved more than life. She exhaled slowly. It might still be valid. If Aunt Ray kept it filed somewhere, it could prove full ownership. Then we take it to town tomorrow. Morning brought no rest. They arrived at the county office just as it opened. Delaney laid the old envelope in front of the clerk. The woman scanned the document. It's dated, signed, witnessed, filed late, but we do have a copy of this on microfiche. You're lucky. Not many do. Does it help us? Delaney asked. The woman smiled. It does more than help. It ends the dispute. Your aunt's will, paired with this deed, proves full ownership of the property. That letter you got last week? Fraud. Trash it. Delaney swayed slightly. Harvey caught her elbow. Thank you, she breathed. No problem, Miss Monroe. If anyone gives you more trouble, send them our way. They returned home just before dusk. Celeste was already waiting on the porch, arms folded. Thought you might be back, she said coolly. Delaney walked past her without a word and unlocked the door. I'm not leaving, Celeste called. Harvey turned. You are, and not just from here. He held up a folder. Forgery, fraud, false claims of ownership. If you ever show up again, I'll see you charged. Celeste's smile cracked, just a little. You wouldn't. Delaney stepped forward. Try us. There was a long pause. Then Celeste turned, heels clicking against the wooden steps, and walked to her car. She didn't look back. Later that night, the fire glowed low. Harvey sat on the floor, legs crossed like a man decades younger. Delaney rested beside him with her head on his shoulder. It's over, she whispered. For now, Harvey said. But we're still here. He smiled. Yeah, we are. The house creaked softly as it settled in the cold. Outside, a light snow began to fall. Delaney looked over at her father. Not the man she had imagined, but something better. Real, solid, still standing. The snow stayed for 3 days. It blanketed the roof, the trees, and the crooked fence posts that lined the edge of the property. It buried the old tire swing behind the shed, softened the brittle remains of last year's garden, and turned the cabin into something out of a postcard. Quiet, white, still. Harvey and Delaney spent those days not doing much at all, just being. They cooked slow meals, chopped wood, played rummy by the fire. He told her about the decades she'd missed, the years he drifted, the shelters, the friendships that flickered out, the long nights wondering if she was warm. She shared the college years she barely remembered, the job she'd taken out of necessity, the fear of becoming like her mother. You're nothing like her, Harvey told her. I know, she said. I just didn't know why. On the 4th morning, the snow melted. Delaney stood outside on the porch, in her slippers, coffee in hand, watching steam rise from the forest floor. The silence was different now, less like isolation, more like peace. Harvey joined her, wrapped in the old grey cardigan he never let her throw out. You ever think about what's next? She asked. Every day. And he looked out over the woods. I want to stay. She smiled softly. I was hoping you'd say. In March, she reopened the old greenhouse behind the cabin. The roof had caved in years ago, but the frame was still good. Harvey helped her reinforce the beams with salvaged wood, and by April, the space was full of seedlings, bright shoots pushing up from the soil, like they knew they belonged. Neighbors began stopping by, curious at first, then helpful. A retired teacher offered to bring compost. A teenage boy asked if he could help shovel the path. Someone dropped off mason jars full of wild honey. They think you're running some kind of mission, Harvey said one evening as he watched Delaney plant snap peas. Maybe I am, she said, just a quieter one. By summer, they had a system. Harvey tended the garden and fixed the roof when it leaked. Delaney taught weekend classes in town, gardening, canning, herbal medicine. People came, listened, stayed. A woman arrived one day with a bruised arm and a silent child. She didn't give her name, just looked at Delaney with wide, fearful eyes. Delaney didn't ask questions. She made up the bed in the loft, left soup on the stove, put fresh towels on the rail. That night, Harvey stood by the fire and stared at the girl asleep upstairs. She reminds me of you, he said softly. I know, Delaney whispered. That's why she's staying. In August, they held a community dinner. Just a few tables dragged into the yard, folding chairs borrowed from the church, and enough cornbread to feed a dozen. People brought whatever they had. Apple pie, jars of pickles, a banjo, laughter. The woman with the bruised arm laughed for the first time all summer. Her son chased fireflies with the neighbor kids. Someone passed around a guitar. When it reached Harvey, he hesitated. Then, quietly, he began to play. A woman arrived one day with a bruised arm and a silent child. She didn't give her name, just looked at Delaney with wide, fearful eyes. Delaney didn't ask questions. She made up the bed in the loft, left soup on the stove, put fresh towels on the rail. That night, Harvey stood by the fire and stared at the girl asleep upstairs. She reminds me of you, he said softly. I know, Delaney whispered. That's why she's staying. In August, they held a community dinner. Just a few tables dragged into the yard, folding chairs borrowed from the church, and enough cornbread to feed a dozen. People brought whatever they had. Apple pie, jars of pickles, a banjo, laughter. The woman with the bruised arm laughed for the first time all summer. Her son chased fireflies with the neighbor kids. Someone passed around a guitar. When it reached Harvey, he hesitated. Then, quietly, he began to play. Harvey's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't think I had one. You do now, she said. You always did. That night, long after the candles were out and the porch had gone dark, Delaney stood at the window and looked out over the land her aunt had loved. She thought of the women who had lived here before her. Quiet, kind women who left room at the table, left lights in the window, left doors unlocked. She understood them now. The world was full of strangers, but some of them were worth waiting for. If you like the story, I would be very happy to have your support. Click the thumbs up. And to not miss new stories, subscribe and click on the bell. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and all the best.